Hello and welcome to another video. In this one we're going to talk about the life of Leslie Payne and his involvement with the Kray firm. Leslie was the twins' financial advisor who masterminded most of the Kray firm's scams and business opportunities. Leslie was a key man in the Kray story and they owed a lot to him for their financial success during the 1960s and especially in the early to mid 1960s. By the time 1966 rolled around, Leslie Payne had distanced himself from the twins and the firm due to the ever-increasing violence the twins were using and the reckless murder of George Cornell by Ronnie Kray in The Blind Beggar in March 1966. The twins would later try to have Leslie Payne killed, which turned out to be a failure and in turn would lead to the death of firm member Jack McVitie, amongst other things that Jack had done wrong. Leslie Payne was born on the 7th of January 1924 in Condicut Mews in Paddington. This is Condicut Mews today. It is lots of old buildings, so we can safely assume that it's pretty much as it was when Leslie Payne was born in 1924. At 17 and a half, he joined the army with the East Surrey Regiment, where he enjoyed his basic training and was posted to North Africa. By 18 years old, he was a corporal in Egypt and was in the invasion of Italy as a lance sergeant. There he was wounded by a mortar shell and the fragments blinded him for 2 months, and some years later he lost a kidney. Leslie Payne was demobbed in 1947 as a sergeant. He then became a long-distance lorry driver, which he'd done for 2 or 3 years. Then he worked for an electric contractor and finally a salesman selling machines for Hoover. During his days in the army, he was dealing in black market stuff stolen from lorries in Crete, and to his surprise, lots of other people were doing it, including corporals and majors and the military police. Things stolen were things like tins of corned beef, pairs of boots, tyres, and all were sellable. This was Leslie Payne's first foray into criminality, and it gave him a taste for being dishonest and gave him good lessons in business sense. After years of dull jobs since leaving the army, Leslie Payne decided that his time would be best spent on the fiddle. One of the jobs Leslie started this in was in a radio firm called Broadmead Radio, where he started as a trainee manager, and within weeks he was running one of the shops where he would buy second-hand TV and radio sets, fix them up and sell them and keep the money, even though they were the property of the radio firm. By 1956, Leslie Payne went and worked for a man called Rapp at another radio shop, and through Rapp he met a man called Freddie Gore. Freddie Gore would also later be involved with the twins along with Leslie Payne. Leslie Payne and Freddie Gore, not too long after meeting, would run a small used car sale site together. During this time, Freddie Gore got involved with some villains in a car scam, and that in turn led Gore and Payne into a meeting with Ronnie and Reggie Kray. Ronnie and Reggie Kray became frequent visitors to the car site and became very friendly with Leslie Payne. I'm sure I heard a different story of how the twins first got involved with Leslie Payne, which involved another person with a car site called Johnny Hutton, who was a friend of the twins. But either way, Leslie Payne first got to know the twins via a car sales business. Leslie Payne's assessment of the twins was that Ronnie Kray was insecure, suspicious and emotional, while Reggie was overborne and frustrated. He says that Ronnie was dark and hopeless, and his whole life was in preparation for a tragedy. He had a death wish, and everything he done showed it. He saw himself as a kind of Custer, fated to die magnificently, besieged by thousands of policemen. He thought of his home at Valence Road as a bunker, a wolf's lair. He said once the twins had lots of money, they spent it on clothes. They were always at the tailors, and they would often give away clothing they had hardly used. They were quite well turned out, even though they didn't exactly look like businessmen. They were clean, always shaved and bathed regularly, at Bethnal Green Baths, just across the street from Valence Road. As Ronnie came to be successful, he saw himself as Noel Coward, though he never perfectly hit it off. He once bought himself a black silk lounging shirt, but the sarcasm at Valence Road was so intense he never dared to wear it. Then he used to stroll around the house in silk dressing gowns, and he craved his own houseboy. At one stage he spent hours chatting up waiters at Chinese restaurants to see if they would do it. When in Nigeria, he was all for bringing back a gigantic young man servant back home. In the end, Ronnie dropped it, but while he had these ideas, he was like a child who wanted to train. He drove everybody around him mad with his nagging. Ronnie insisted he dominated everything we did. He had no ability to think out consequences of things. He could be ruthless, bloody, terror, as much as he could be like a child with whom you had to reason over things. But even that wasn't much use, as when he made a decision about something, that was it, and the others had to fall in line with him. His business sense was non-existent, but that didn't stop him making any number of decisions. In spite of being concerned over a number of gambling clubs, the twins never understood the games. They could not put down a bet on Kemi, and they had no idea how the odds went on roulette. Since they had managers at the clubs and Charlie and me, there was no need for them to be there at all. The brothers could have just come in once every few days, but Ronnie would spend hours and hours sitting in a huge chair at Esmeralda's barn, just watching. Occasionally he would go to the kitchen and cut himself a gigantic sandwich. Ronnie was a difficult companion because he had no sense of humour. A joke for him was somebody basically getting smashed over the head. Charlie Kray liked to joke, but Ronnie would always put the damper on things, because if it wasn't something he had thought of, he wouldn't laugh or smile. He would just sit there and kill himself with his own bits of humour, which no one else saw the point of. For instance, one evening they were in the Regency Club, and Tommy Brown, or Tommy Welsh, whatever we care to call him, who's 6'3", was chasing a little bloke down the stairs and bashing him with a broom. This killed Ronnie. Ronnie was possessive and defensive by turns. Ronnie was so uncertain of himself that if he was in one of the clubs and he heard someone laughing, he would think the joke was on him. In general, Ronnie also felt he had to have Reggie, Charlie and myself with him as many hours of the day as possible. Otherwise he felt he lost his grip of the situation. He wanted the security and felt vulnerable when alone. He was mad about celebrities, perhaps because their company proved importance. On a few occasions he was with Sonny Liston or Lord Boothby. He would just sit with his mouth open. This was not intended to be rude, just that he had no small talk beyond, "What are you going to have to drink? Wow, do you want a fag then?" Reggie, on the other hand, was all for enjoying a better life. He yearned for faraway places, physically and spiritually. Unlike his twin, he liked to travel and meet new people, to enjoy new sensations. The two were evenly matched physically, and not a week went by without a punch-up. A frequent cause of the trouble was Ron's homosexuality. He always wanted to take boys out in the evening, while Reggie preferred girls. While Reggie enjoyed hurting humans, he was quite sentimental to animals and quite unable to damage them, but he was terrified of rats and mice. Reggie was also over-loving towards children. Whenever he met a child, he would spend hours chatting to them, and when they parted, his presents would not be shillings but pounds. Reggie was always split between two images of himself, the big gangster and the smooth business executive. On some of the Krays violence, Leslie Payne said, "A man was nearly stabbed to death in the Le Monde by Ronnie. The police went there and found him lying in a pool of blood and rushed him off to the hospital, where they fortunately saved his life. There was quite a lot of people present that saw this happen and who knew who did it, but nobody made a statement about it. When the man was questioned, he said that Ronnie Kray had done it, but when he had a couple of hours to think about it, he changed his statement and he said he was attacked by strangers." Over the years, there was hardly a member of their gang that hadn't been cut, shot, beaten or stabbed. Billy Exley said in evidence at the Kray trial that he slept with a shotgun by his bed to protect him from the Krays. Wherever the Krays went, they would have their eyes open for a quarrel, a chance to hit someone, just to prove how frightening they were. Leslie Payne was also present at the branding of Lenny Hamilton at Esmeralda's barn, and he had this to say about the incident. Ronnie said to me that he had sent for Hamilton and wanted to have a word with him. About 12:30, Hamilton came into the barn, and this particular night the gaming tables were not very busy. He was taken into the kitchen and sat down in an armchair we had there. Also present were Dave Forland, Teddy Smith and Billy Exley. Sometime after he had sent for Hamilton, Ronnie had gone into the kitchen and put a butcher's sharpening iron on the gas ring. The first I saw of this is when he picked it up and put it across Hamilton's cheek. Hamilton jumped out of the chair and started screaming his head off, which was quite natural under the circumstances. Ronnie ended up beating Hamilton around the head and shoulders with this iron. I stopped this little performance, grabbed hold of Hamilton and pushed him to the door. Ronnie turned around and said, "If you try and leave here, you will get hurt." I continued pushing Hamilton towards the door. I asked him if he wanted to be taken to the hospital, but he informed me that he had a cab waiting downstairs and that he would be able to get there under his own steam. Dave Forland eventually took him downstairs and put him in a taxi. Leslie Payne also says that several times Ronnie Kray went to kill people, but he was prevented. Reggie stopped him killing Connie Whitehead, and Payne stopped him killing Pat Connolly. Incidentally, he says, Reggie went to ISO's restaurant to shoot Frankie Fraser, but Frankie Fraser didn't show up. Payne says the Richardsons did things in more style and didn't kill anyone. The Krays, although messy and disorganised, tended to be more final. They were psychopathic. Once they had done one killing, it became very easy for them. What the Krays desired most was respectability, to be accepted by the general public, in particular those who they considered mattered. To do that, they had to use another vehicle other than fear. They found two: charity and show business. These are quite revealing opinions on the twins by Leslie Payne, and we have to remember these thoughts by him were recorded as early as 1968, so their personalities would have been fresh in his mind. Really, the only other recollection of the twins that was fresh from that time was from John Pearson, as he was with the twins in late 1967 and the start of 1968, with his book The Profession of Violence being released in the early 1970s. Other people around the twins during their freedom wrote books, but they were recalling memories from 20 plus years in the past, so it's good to see a look at them from someone whose memory was fresh and at the time, rather than 20 plus years later. Leslie Payne was a very intelligent man with a good memory for facts and figures, and he was an expert witness at the Kray trial in 1969. Leslie Payne orchestrated all, or mostly all, of the twins' business successes from the early 1960s until the mid-1960s. These included long-firm frauds and the purchasing of clubs like Esmeralda's Barn, the Kentucky Club, and the Hideaway Club. Of course, the twins had some success on their own with the Billiard Hall in Mile End and the Double R Club in Bow, but the big successes of the Kray firm came with the arrival of Leslie Payne. During this time, the twins had more money than they could spend. Reggie brought a houseboat but forgot about it. Ronnie brought a racehorse. He also brought gold wristwatches and cigarette cases for his boyfriends. On top of all the clubs and frauds that Leslie Payne had orchestrated, the twins were also getting money from the protection racket. Life under the wing of Leslie Payne was very good indeed. Leslie Payne became known to the firm as Payne the Brain, or the man with the briefcase. Leslie Payne was an expert businessman and fraudster. This type of person was not exclusive to the Kray firm. The Richardsons over the water in South London also had a Payne-esque man called Jack Duval, who oversaw lots of business dealings and frauds for Charlie and Eddie. Jack DeVal would allegedly later rip them off and flee with some money. I don't know much about Jack DeVal, so I don't know if he was of the same calibre as Leslie Payne, or if his success was greater. I'm sure either one would have been a big asset to any criminal empire during the 1960s. Charlie Richardson expanded his criminal enterprises to Africa when he got involved in mining out there. I don't know how legal or illegal any of it was with Charlie Richardson out in Africa, but we can assume a good proportion was illegal. Not to be outdone on this front, the twins decided to go into Africa themselves when they got involved with what was called the Enugu project. Enugu is located in southeastern Nigeria. The Enugu project has a comedic scene in the film Legend about the twins, with Ronnie Kray played by the great Tom Hardy and Leslie Payne played by the great David Thewlis. Ronnie Kray in the film wants Leslie Payne to get him £5,000 out of the bank for the project in Enugu, with Ronnie explaining it was for the children and he wanted to build a city. It is a funny scene in the film, but the project wasn't really a laughing matter for the twins or Leslie Payne, and it all ended badly with the twins losing money and Leslie Payne ending up in a Nigerian prison. The project started with Leslie Payne meeting Ernest Shinwell in 1962, where Shinwell asked Leslie Payne if he could help him with a perfectly honest scheme to build 3,000 houses and shops at the new capital of eastern Nigeria. Ernest Shinwell was the son of a politician. Leslie Payne and Ernest Shinwell flew out to Enugu to have a look at the project. This is the moment Leslie Payne decided to get involved, and he and his partner Freddie Gore became directors of a company called Enugu Limited, which owned 64 acres at the site in Enugu. The scheme was sound and the land was worth £750,000, and the land could be mortgaged to provide bridging allowance. 2 Nigerian building contractors had been signed up to do £50,000 worth of work each before they would get paid, and there were another 3 firms eager to do work on the same terms. In addition to these terms, each firm was paid £5,000 for the privilege of having the contract. The twins visited Enugu. Reggie went once and Ronnie, I believe, went twice, and there are photographs of the twins taken while there. One of Ronnie's requests on one of the visits was to see the local prison, and in one picture Ronnie can be seen with a police officer after or before the visit to the prison. For a while everything went well. Architects and surveyors were engaged, plans drawn and estimates were prepared. The first contractor paid his introductory fee to Freddie Gore and Charlie Kray. Charlie Kray was with the party in the capacity as a tourist. Charlie Kray said, "We best take the money back home as the boys are a bit short of readies." So he took the £5,000 back home. On the second visit to Enugu for Payne and the others, including Charlie Kray, the same contractor wanted another contract for another 500 houses, but Payne decided it was better to wait. The contractor insisted that he gets another contract or he wants his £5,000 back that he paid on the first visit, and he set a certain amount of hours for him to have his money back. The money could not be paid on time, and Payne and his architect were arrested while trying to leave the country and put in a local prison, charged with impersonating company directors. Payne managed to ring Charlie Kray, who was at the airport, and Charlie then came back to Enugu, while a man called Gordon Anderson, a Canadian associate, was sent off to London to try to raise the £5,000 needed to free Leslie Payne and his architect. Leslie Payne had a tough time in the prison. Between 3 people in a cell, they had a pint of water every 24 hours and a bowl of rice to share, and the cells were very small. The twins were tasked with raising the £5,000, and in the meantime, Charlie Kray's passport was confiscated as assurance, and Leslie Payne was freed from prison to go to a hotel. The money was eventually raised, and Payne and the others were free to go. According to Leslie Payne, when he arrived back in London, he said the whole Kray gang were ready to leave and go to Enugu to break them out of prison. I assume this was one of Ronnie Kray's less sane ideas, and I have no doubt he would have sent the men off to Enugu to more than likely end up in a squalid hot prison cell themselves with a bowl of rice and a pint of water. It's also worth noting that this Enugu scheme was where Ronnie Kray tried to get Lord Robert Boothby involved by investing some money into it. A meeting was held at Boothby's flat at 1 Eaton Square in London, and we have the famous set of photographs of Ronnie, Boothby, Teddy Smith and Leslie Holt that day in Boothby's flat. Lord Boothby supposedly declined Ronnie's offer of a chance of investing in the Enugu project, but he didn't decline the association with the twins and invites to Ronnie Kray's homosexual parties at Ronnie's flat at 8 Cedar Court at Casanova Road in Clapton, which led to what was called the Peer and the Gangster scandal that broke out in July 1964. As well as the clubs, frauds and the Enugu project, in 1965 Leslie Payne was involved with the selling of stolen bonds, which the twins also got involved in. When I say the twins were involved, I just think they were just there to have a share of the proceeds. I don't think they actually done any legwork. So after the disaster that was the Enugu project, money started flowing again in 1965 for the twins and Payne. On March the 9th, 1966, Ronnie Kray shot and killed fellow villain George Cornell in the Blind Beggar pub in Whitechapel. We can only really speculate what George's crimes was, but it was more than likely born out of hatred and jealousy by Ronnie towards George Cornell. George was of course a member of the Richardson gang south of the river in South London. This is the moment when things changed in the world of the twins and the people around them. Before this, as far as we know, it was beatings, stabbings, the odd bullet in the leg and a right-hander. This was a new level reached by the twins, the level of murder, and not down a dark alley at 4 in the morning type of murder. This was a murder at 8 on a Wednesday evening in a pub in the middle of the East End on a busy high street with the pub full of witnesses. Around that area, everybody knew Ronnie and Reggie Kray. The Blind Beggar is in the heart of what you would call Kray territory. Literally 200 yards down the road from the Blind Beggar was Ronnie Kray's favourite pub, the Grave Maurice, in which he was a regular. This is the moment things changed. This is the moment lots of the old guard of the firm started to drift away. Men who had been loyal to the twins since the early days of the billiard hall in Eric Street in Mile End and the Double R Club in Bow. Leslie Payne also left the Kray firm behind in early 1966 and distanced himself from the twins. Leslie Payne was into business, making a quick pal note, not gratuitous violence for the sake of it, and now murder. Reggie probably wanted the same as Leslie Payne, but it was Ronnie. Ronnie had different aims. The money never meant much to Ronnie. Ronnie wanted to be feared and hurt people who didn't fall in line with his demands. Two different agendas clashing. With Ronnie's strong, forceful personality, there was only ever going to be one winner, and it wasn't the Leslie Payne way. By the time 1967 rolled around, Ronnie was getting suspicious that Leslie Payne could cooperate with the police as he knew too much. He decided that Payne had to go and tasked on and off firm member Jack McVitie and Billy Exley to kill Payne. Jack McVitie, it seems, was very unreliable in everything he did for the twins, so why he was tasked with killing Leslie Payne, who knows? Drugged up most of the time and a heavy drinker. Maybe he was the only one to put his hand up for the job in desperation for some cash. The rest of the firm were not killers. Give someone a beating if they were out of line, but not killers. Billy Exley had no choice but to go along with McVitie as a driver. As expected, the attempted killing was a failure. Leslie Payne's wife answered the door of Payne's house when McVitie and Exley knocked loudly, and she just said, "He's not in." "That's all right," said McVitie, and he and Exley left. McVitie was given £500 for the job in advance, with another £500 to come on completion. Instead of repaying the money, McVitie kept it. This incident led in part to McVitie's death in October 1967. If Leslie Payne wasn't cooperating with the police before, he certainly would be doing so now. Leslie Payne, now had no other option. In the autumn of 1967, the police started to really pick up the pace in their investigations of the Kray firm, and they collected quite a lot of information, but none of it really stuck until they heard that Leslie Payne's life had been threatened. Detective Sergeant L.G. Hemingway went to see Payne and notify him of the threat to his life, but of course Payne already knew this. In December 1967, Leslie Payne had his first meeting with Leonard Nipper Reid, who was in charge of this new Kray investigation. Previous investigations into the Kray firm never really came to anything. They were nearly caught out in their 1965 trial over demanding money with menaces from Hugh McCowan and his hideaway club in Soho, but the twins and Teddy Smith were acquitted of that after a spell in prison on remand. This new effort in nabbing the twins and their firm proceeded with a bit more gusto. Nipper Reid called this meeting with Leslie Payne a fishing expedition, and the meeting was arranged to be at Lyons Corner House in the Strand. Incidentally, the twins used to frequent Lyons Corner House during their youth when they were coming up. At the meeting, it was a bit of a getting to know each other. Payne wanted to know what was in it for him if he came on the side of law and order. Nipper Reid said that he would deal with Payne honestly and fairly, and Nipper asked for the same in return. The meeting ended with a promise to meet again, and for Nipper Reid it was a very successful meeting. Nipper Reid knew about Payne as their paths had crossed once before in the past, and he knew Payne was an intelligent man and very different from anyone else connected to the Kray firm. The reason Payne gave for divorcing himself from the Krays was that he could no longer control their unnecessary violence. He liked to feel he was cultured, he enjoyed the good life that crime provided, he liked dining well, drinking good wine and having stimulating conversation. On the face of it, he was the managing director, organising things, but the twins were going off having bursts of violence, eroding the discipline he was trying to build up. At the next meeting, a few days later, Nipper Reid brought into play the idea of having a statement from Leslie Payne, but in that statement he would have to admit to certain involvement in the shady things of the Kray firm. Nipper Reid promised he would do all he could to make sure that Payne wasn't prosecuted. Leslie Payne did make a statement, and it was 146 pages long, and him and Nipper Reid put the statement together in the library of a quiet police section house in Marylebone. There was no way Payne could be seen at the headquarters of the Kray investigation, which was a building called Tintagel House along the Albert Embankment in London. The statement covered long firm frauds, stolen bonds, forged currency, the sale of drugs, blackmail and assaults, as well as an enormous amount of general background of information about the day-to-day running of the Krays enterprises. It was hard for Payne to speak of all this, as he was deeply cemented in these activities himself, but nevertheless he went through them meticulously, giving Nipper Reid exactly what he wanted. Obviously, Leslie Payne had to speak on Freddie Gore, his partner in a lot of projects with the twins, and especially out in Enugu. So Freddie Gore was also now on Nipper Reid's shopping list of people to speak to, which he duly did. With all this, Leslie Payne gave evidence at the Kray trial. The evidence would have been about the business side of things, bar little bits of violence he did witness, like Lenny Hamilton's branding. He couldn't really provide any real information on the murders of Jack McVitie or George Cornell or Frank Mitchell, as by early 1966 he was distancing himself from the Kray firm. I would assume this would have been at the time of George Cornell's killing, which he wouldn't have known about until it happened, as nobody really did, as it wasn't planned or anything. It was done by Ronnie on the spur of the moment, it seems. After the Kray trial, it wasn't long before Leslie Payne was back in a courtroom, as in 1972 he was convicted to 5 years imprisonment for conspiracy to pervert the course of justice. At his trial, the manuscript of his book, The Brotherhood, was produced in evidence and described by the prosecuting counsel as a how to do it book of crime. I don't know how Payne fared in prison. I should imagine he would have spent a lot of time away from the general population, although it was very early days into the twins and the firm's prison sentence, so I'm not sure what influence they had at the time within the prison system to get somebody to get at Leslie Payne. Obviously, as years went by, they would have had influence to get the word out to harm people if they knew of a fellow inmate in another prison was serving a sentence, or other prisoners they knew were being moved to a certain prison. But I doubt they would have had that kind of influence to get at Leslie Payne in the early to mid 1970s. Leslie Payne was known to have 2 daughters and lived in a suburban house in Dulwich, and he died in 1990, aged 66. As much as people like David Litvinoff were crucial in the Krays promotion during the 1960s and helping to create the mythology that surrounded them and still surrounds them to this day, Leslie Payne was crucial for their success on the financial front. He was integral to the whole setup the Kray firm had during the early to mid 1960s, when the Krays were at their peak of power that they exerted in the Bethnal Green area and in some of the West End of London. Without Leslie Payne, the story of the Krays would have been totally different, and they needed him more than he needed them. Of course, being associated with the Kray firm had major advantages for Payne to get ahead in any shady business deals. Just having them at the meeting could probably have clinched the deal, and I'm sure it did, especially in things like the taking over of clubs. The twins probably needed no words of input in any deal, their presence alone was enough. The stories from David Litvinoff to his upper class and celebrity friends no doubt travelled far and wide and cemented the myth of the twins. I don't think Leslie Payne would have helped the police if it was not for the attempt on his life. I suppose it does beg the question, if Payne would have answered his door that day to Jack McVitie and Billy Exley, would Jack McVitie have pulled the trigger? I suppose £1,000 for the completed job was a lot of money in the late 1960s, so who knows. I think the twins shot themselves in the foot with this one, but like most things in the world of the twins, these mad schemes were the work of a very unwell man in the driving seat of the firm, Ronnie Kray. So that's about it for this video. This was a look at the life of Leslie Payne and his involvement with the Kray firm. As always, I would like to thank you all for watching the video, and I do hope you have enjoyed it. Before I go, I would like to direct you to a Facebook group, the Krays Crime Lords of London group. If any of you have Facebook, it would be great to have you in the group. There is lots of discussion on the Krays going on in there, and it's well worth joining if you're on Facebook. The link will be in the description under the video. So that's it for now. Thank you all for watching, and I will see you again in the next one. Thank you.